for the benefit of those who weren't, why don't we get started? We have a few more who may trickle in, but I think it makes sense to begin. There's certainly a lot to talk about. So thank you all for joining us, particularly on such short notice. We decided really at the last minute to put this together, and I'm really very impressed at the response, actually, which I think shows how much interest and actually concern there is about the Zapad exercises and some of the broader questions in European security and the U.S.-Russia relationship. So we're very pleased to have with us today two, I think, very thoughtful speakers. To my right, Peter Zwack, a senior fellow at the National Defense University, a retired brigadier general, a career Army foreign area officer, that's I think how one says it, and really a long-time observer and expert on the Russian military, who I guess your final post was as defense attaché, in Moscow, and Peter, as we mentioned in our invitation, actually was an observer for the 2013 Zapad exercise, and we hope to hear a little bit about that. Then to my left, Michael Kaufman, a research scientist at CNA, also a fellow at the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, himself actually formerly at the National Defense University, and I think also a very well-informed observer of the Russian military and often a provocative commentator on that topic as well. So with that brief introduction, we'd like Peter first for 10 minutes, then Mike for 10 minutes, then we'll open it up for conversation.
Thank you, Paul, and friends. It's a real honor to talk to you. I think this is a really important time to focus on this. If there are going to be three themes that I would want to talk about, we can get it into the Q&A, and Michael's going to get into much more detail on the exercise, will be, first, what is this all about? What is this exercise connote? Is it an exercise as a standalone thing, or is it part of a societal-wide preparation to get the Russians possibly ready for conflict with the West? And there are many, many questions that link to that. Two, we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of the transforming, evolving Russian military that have, in between 2014 and 2017, right after Zapad 13, had a troika of major military operations that covered the full range, if you will, of non-nuclear military operations, all the way from gray zone little green men to full-blown, attributed strategic level conventional operations in Syria. And then finally, I think this is maybe the most important thing. It's the soft power aspects of this. What is the regime saying? What's their narrative? How are they prepping Russian society for such a thing? And I think that these exercises are far more than just firepower demonstrations, but they are, if you look at the entire infrastructure of Zapad, and you see the numbers of 13,000 to 100,000, much of it is infrastructure and support, logistics, getting the society ready in a way that I think we in the West have challenged really comprehending. Context is important, and I'm going to try to lay a little bit of a backdrop to this in my few minutes. First of all, I even before Zapad 2013, I attended Caucasus South Exercise 2012. that was the last exercise that General Makarov, Chief of the General Staff, and the past Minister of Defense Sergeyukov were there. And they were part of the New Look Russian reforms that kicked off in 2008. And so they were there, big firepower exercise, and that was sort of the precursor, if you will, to Zapad 13. What happened in Zapad 13 was an interesting time. We didn't know what was going on exactly in the big picture, but all of us had a feeling that things were cascading negatively. First of all, the regime, the Russian regime, I would submit, had a more existential worry in 2013 and going into 14 than it does now. The 2011-2012 Bolotnaya demonstrations that had large populations in the streets really were a major concern. Russians had to deal with it. And then in Moscow, I was there, we had to deal with just bad, negative things, whether it was the Magnitsky, which was the right thing to do, but the Magnitsky Act and adoptions, and my neighbor, the USAID head, soft power guy had to leave. All this was considered dangerous by the Russians, and when we went to Zapad on September 26, 2013, this was in the background. What happens at Zapad 2013 is it's a full-blown exercise. It's a so-called terrorist operation, counter-terrorist operation with Western, anti-Western connotations, meaning the West, NATO, U.S. were obviously backing it. And where we flew to Kaliningrad, Baltitsk, and there were about 40 to 50 of us attachés. We all came in on an old Ilyushin from Moscow. And there we were on the coastline, and in comes in the little motorcade with Putin, Lukashenko, and his son Kolya. Very interesting. Remember, the Zapad exercises are a combined Belarusian exercise, and then with them was was Shoigu, was Sergei, and it was his first big exercise since he came in with Gerasimov earlier in that year, and it was just classic firepower. We were all there, and it was, I think, meant to impress the world, impress the Russian population, impress the attachés because they know we report, and intimidate their neighbors, and also, I think, reassure the population, the Russian population, because the narrative is important. So at this time begins the SNAP exercises, which is very important because Russians are mobilizing their society also for possible conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, this does not mean they want to go to war, but they're psychologically getting ready. In their world of existential threats, they see threats, they spin them, most of them are perceived, but there are a number of contrived threats, as we all know, that they spin their population, which is anxious about war. In my last visit to Russia at the end of August, there was, in late spring, a Russian friend I've known for 28 years said, "Pyotr, будет война." This is a moderate guy. "Peter, is there going to be a war?" And this is a moderate, non-affiliated government person who's worried. So they're anxious over there. So the exercise itself, firepower, airstrikes, helicopters, sea landing, amphibious troops. There was going to be an airborne drop, but it was canceled because of high winds. Putin is very engaged. Putin goes to all the military exercises, which is just, it shows us, and I think most of our countries, our presidents don't. And I just think it is indicative of how important these are for him. Again, all this is going on for context. So as we go and then right afterward, 2 months later, the Maidan things start to occur. But even in the kind of end of the reset, General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the still newly minted Gerasimov meet in Brussels in January of 2014, 1 month before it really goes down in Ukraine and Crimea. So a lot is going on as background. The Russians then, as you know, I believe it's a reactive, preemptive assault into Ukraine. You all know the story. And then many lessons learned between 2014 to 2017. That brings us now up to Zapad 2017. What does this mean? And of course, we have the issues, the regional issues of Belarus, the Baltics, Ukraine continues to bubble. And I just wanted to kind of paint a picture where we are. The last thing is I think the Russian regime at this time, unlike 2013, is feeling a little bit more secure if regime perpetuation is one of the things that worry them most. Michael, over to you.
Thanks very much.
And I misidentified Mike, who's a senior research scientist.
It's all right.
At CNN. Sorry.
Maybe sooner, no more the smarter. So, Peter, fantastic intro. Very much thank you for putting it into context, especially based on your personal experience. I had a great time with you in Moscow back in April during MCIS. So I'm going to talk a little about what the actual exercise is, and will not delve too much into the weeds. If you're interested, I have an article on that subject, and there are a number of great articles at the National Interest also, I think, that have come out recently that cover some of the details. So without further ado, let me talk a little bit about the sort of coming dreaded clash between Vaishnoria, Vaisbaria, Lubania, and the Russian Federation, right, which are the hypothetical countries in place that are essentially stand-ins for a coalition of a number of NATO countries in the Baltic region, titularly supported by the United States. Well, first, in essence, it's important to understand that Zapad 2017 is both an exercise in and of itself that will take place September 14th through 20th, so we got 2 more days, and a very long series of exercise, snap readiness checks, joint drills that take place in the run-up to spring and summer, and will continue after September, probably into October and November. So it's not just one set-piece event that's taking place. It's a bit of a misnomer, right? Indeed, Russian troops have already been in Belarus throughout the spring and summer drilling. Paratroopers, electronic warfare troops, Spetsnaz, the forces that will be actively taking place, participating in this event in the coming week have already been in Belarus to practice and have left, and they're going to come back. Next. Alongside this exercise will be a host of other exercises in Russia, other military districts, not just the Western one, many different fleets. Air Force will deploy tactical aviation, probably long-range aviation. So there'll be a lot of events going on timed to, within the same week. Actual exercise itself, what's happening, what really does happen September 14th to 20th, is a 2-phase exercise where phase 1 will be probably about 3 days, and this is a similar experience with Zapad 2013. Where first Russian and Belarusian forces together will respond to armed incursion diversionary groups, no doubt sponsored by these hypothetical states which somewhat represent Poland, Lithuania, Latvia. And these groups will essentially be looking to destabilize the Belarusian state and drive a wedge between Minsk and Moscow, try to create some kind of color revolution and whatnot. And so in phase 1, they will try to find, fix, finish these diversionary groupings. Phase 2 is really the high-end fight part of the exercise, and that's where a lot of Russian forces will swing into gear, assuming that the crisis escalated into actual conflict, and there they will prefer essentially deploy to first deter, and then if they have to fight a hypothetical conventional enemy, which you would assume to be a coalition titularly led by the United States. That's the military part of the exercise, and in that we're going to see a lot of interesting things about to what extent Russia is able to move forces into theater. There'll be a lot focused this time around on logistics, how Russia can command combined armed formations, basically groupings from different service branches, all those nuts and bolts of military affairs. And to be frank, 4 years is a pretty long time when it comes to Russian military reform modernization to see the evolution of Russian armed forces. There's a pretty big gap between 2013 and 2017. Because what happened in between these 4 years is, incidentally, annexation of Crimea, the fight in eastern Ukraine, from which the Russian military took a lot of combat lessons experience, and 2 years basically of conflict in Syria as well. So the exercise is actually for the West, and I think for the United States, a very important opportunity. Now it's happening no matter what, so it's not like we get a vote as to whether or not they're doing Zapad, right? It's going to happen, and it happens every 4 years since 1999. But it's a distinct opportunity to actually see evolution of Russian armed forces, what can they deploy into theater, and get a much better assessment of the potential of the threat to NATO, and see what their actual capacity is for command and control, and how the Russian military organizes and responds. Now, the other part of this is, of course, a large civil military coordination and civil defense exercise. It takes place across Russia. It tests the reservist system. It tests the National Guard. Now, last time, one of the big changes was Ministry of Interior troops that deployed across Russia to basically defend the regime against potential protest, instability, internal color revolution. The National Guard was born last year out of the Ministry of Interior troops, so we should see that force probably take in and mobilize and across Russian cities. They'll deploy for some hypothetical mobilization of protest potential of the population and kind of suppress instability. Okay, actual size. So we know, of course, the figures reported were 12,700. It's a very convenient number below the Vienna documents threshold of 13,000. Naturally, that's not true. Real figure, I'll be frank, depends on how you count. So here's the truth. There's not going to be 100,000 Russian troops deploying across NATO borders. I'll be honest, I've seen the number a lot in the press, and that number is entirely spun out, just pulled out of air. There's no factual basis for it. I know it sounds great, but there's absolutely no, how can I put it, no rationale behind that figure. So while it depends how you count the real deployment of Russian forces, realistically, when you look at Zapad 2013 and what you're likely to get in this exercise, you're probably looking at about 65,000 to 70,000 troops all in all. It's a bit debatable how many will be operating in the Baltic region. The way you get such high fantastical numbers that a lot of people consider that in 2013, the total number of Russian forces involved, not just those in the Baltic regions, but wider Western Military District, Northern Fleet up in the Arctic, was about 70,000. And then across Russia, there were about 20,000 Ministry of Interior troops involved in the sort of protest suppression. That got to 90,000. And the 90,000 is not a good number because it's really close to 100,000. And all you need to do is add 10,000 to get to 100,000. Of course, media people said, 100,000 is a much better rounder number than 90. So we should go with 100, right? So that's the reality of where the 100 came from. There's absolutely no basis behind it. Realistically, I think, based on the numbers and the logistics and all the things that are going on, look, you have more than 30,000 Russian troops that live in the theater, between the forces in Kaliningrad, the forces around St. Petersburg, right? No surprise the Russian army happens to be based in Russia, right? So those forces will be very actively engaged participating in exercise. And then you're probably going to have 15,000 plus troops from other major ground formations that are going to deploy to Belarus and to that theater. These are the various elements of 1st Tank Guards Army that people discuss, but you'll get other forces as well. And then you'll add all the troops that the Northern Fleet has to offer, so you're probably going to get to about 65,000, maybe 70 total in the area. All right. Now, do they actually participate? Well, I'll be honest. The truth, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, is, anyone who answered the phone and answered their email during this exercise technically counts as a participant. And in some ways, the interaction on the size of the Russian forces involved is kind of a forced feedback between Russian Ministry of Defense announcements, trying to please their leadership and come up with really large numbers, and Western media. So if they have, if they don't really differentiate between people who fell in on tanks and drove to the Baltic, right, or were transported there by rail car, versus people that just, answered their phone, part of a command staff exercise, and they say, well, we're at 70,000, the Western media says we have 100,000, and they immediately point to us, and say, look, great news, we had even more than we anticipated, we had 100,000, it's a colossal success. The last part of this exercise, to me, is actually probably the most important one. So we understand the military part of this, right? The actual test of Russia's military to be able to deploy forces there, command them in a hypothetical high-end fight against the United States and several allied countries. We understand the civil military part of it, suppressing instability in Russia, preparing, mobilizing essentially the state and testing how a military district might take authority over key civilian infrastructure, how Russian governors would work with key military commanders as part of basically total mobilization for a conflict against an existential threat. Now, the third part of it is really strategic deterrence, right? To me, this principal exercise, not a bilateral exercise between Russia and Belarus, is almost a bilateral exercise between Russia and the United States, because what Russia's trying to do, by and large, is establish coercive credibility with the United States. Russia's scenario, Russia's version of the Baltic high-end fight, has always been this nightmarish scenario of the United States, or not the United States, but some Baltic countries in the lead, trying to subvert the, Russian-friendly, not just regime, but union state with Belarus in Minsk, and then this escalating from a crisis to an actual conflict where it's used by the West as a casus belli for, so-called humanitarian intervention. And understanding that ultimately the United States and NATO have, in the long run of a conflict, substantial conventional superiority, what Russia's been really trying to do is to compel and coerce the United States and come up with a system, and you can see it throughout a lot of both Russian writing and official documents like national security strategy or military doctrine, called strategic deterrence, right? And that's a phase system of how you shape adversary decision-making starting with a crisis so that they will not want to initiate hostilities against Russia. And then if the crisis actually results to conflict, how do you control the situation in the initial phases of conflict? Basically, how do you do escalation control, and how do you lead on escalation, and what war termination strategies do you have such that you could end hostilities on terms favorable to yourself, right? And you're going to see this probably play throughout both Zapad 2017 and potentially other exercises that follow on afterwards. Like I said, it's important to understand that the show does not end on September 20th. There'll be a host of both multinational exercises, but there could be some big follow-on exercise pieces that take place in the Russian military still through October and November, right? So what the Russians basically try and signal is, well, we both have the conventional capability to defend Belarus, to intervene in Belarus in the event that the West is trying to still a color revolution, and we have the resolve. And here is sort of how we're going to try to build up a coercive credibility in a crisis and also demonstrate some of the means that Russia has, both conventional but potentially even nuclear. I don't know if that necessarily is going to happen, but it's happened in some exercises before. But also signaling the willingness to go and escalate to asymmetric employment of nuclear weapons in the conflict. So without that, I'm going to close this out because I think there's a lot of room for Q&A here and turn this back over to our moderator, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. I'm very impressed that both of you kept very strictly to the 10 minutes. Thank you. So let's open it up for questions. Please identify yourself when you have a question. Jerry Bremer.
I just follow up on that last point. Do you expect to see nuclear escalation tested in Satellite 13 like it was part of the game?
Okay, I'll take that. So the short answer is a very distinct possibility that will either be a part of this exercise itself, or it may be a part of a follow-on exercise that could be focused on either Russian strategic nuclear forces or dual-purpose forces that follows this one later on. Because I think the real exercise training regimen really intensifies as we get into August. Right now we have a whole host of snap readiness checks. Russian logistics and other forces had already arrived in Belarus back in August, but it's going to carry on through October and November. So if it doesn't take place during this actual coming week, there might be a follow-on piece, within weeks or a month afterwards. And also, just to say, it's not necessarily so easy and obvious to tell, nor do Russians necessarily announce to you, hey, by the way, this is the part where we're testing nuclear escalation, although they assume that a country with the means like the United States can see such things. But a lot of what you would consider to be dual-capable forces will be involved in this exercise as general-purpose forces that have the potential to employ non-strategic nuclear weapons will be involved throughout this exercise.
I could add a little bit. Open source, they may be stressing, if you will, some of their strategic rocket forces, maybe do rollout, if you will, of their road mobile systems, or as we used to do in the Cold War, fly into Iskandar's forward notional nuclear tipped missiles. But they will definitely, in some way, we believe, exercise it, but they'll be careful about it too.
Mm-hmm. But that a big part of where Zapad 2017 is now is the Russians had always thought that escalation with nuclear weapons was a stopgap solution as part of a deterrent strategy against the United States until the conventional military gets strong enough and capable such that it could really impose serious costs. And they feel that by and large they are there now, and they're trying to transition and wean themselves off a strategy based on nuclear weapons for deterrence, instead focusing a lot more on conventional deterrence. And conventional strike options, at the very least, is an intermediary intervening step in a conflict before having to use nuclear weapons. So a large part of what we will likely be shown to convince us is that Russia has very robust conventional options in a conflict prior to having to resort to use nuclear weapons.
Dave Majumdar from the National Interest Magazine.
Question for both you guys. How far along is the Russian military reform? I mean, we've seen this progress since 2008, since the Georgia War, and they've gotten progressively better, but it hasn't been fully completed. What's your assessment of where we are now?
They are. Let's go back to, okay, you go back to 1999. They had major problems as a result of the old, if you will, style, still Soviet type of Russian military, and they struggled in Georgia. In 2008, again, they bring in Makarov and Sergikov, and they go in a very, very tough reform, cut the bloat out, reduce the officer corps, streamline. They're both fired in 12. And then Gerasimov and Shoigu both come in, the chief of general staff and the defense minister. Ladies and gentlemen, they've both been there now for 5 years, so they have Putin's. They're credible in Putin's eye, and if anything, you would call them they're efficient, and they continue it. And then getting what Michael talked about, they have been in the last 3 years been in a real world operational learning curve where they have units have been in combat at all spectrums, whether attributed or non-attributed. But I would submit that the improvements in the reform, it's uneven. There are aspects of the Russian military growing that are really good, and you have elites. But remember, you still have 30 to 40% that are one-year conscripts. And it's hard to work a military with conscripts, especially if you're trying to work cross-border adventures, because you don't want to put your conscripts of social media into a place that's kind of contested. So they've got a lot of things going on. If you were to ask me, 1/3 of their military is really good now. 1/3 of their military is not bad. It's credible. But that other third, and they can't get to 1 million active duty still, is still their round out units, their mobilization base. That whole piece is another discussion, mobilization base. But they are much better than they were since Georgia 2008, and even more so in 2014. But the reform is uneven. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, the sanctions matter, because with that comes modernization and procurement. And while they've been doing a lot of really neat things and capabilities, whether it's new age weapons and electronic warfare and all of that, they can't buy a lot of Armata tanks. And they can't buy a lot of packs and things like that. So it's taking time. Bottom line, they are much better than what they were. They have studied us intensely since certainly 99 Desert Storm and 2003 in Iraq again. And they have built, if you will, capabilities that have in part mitigated what we used to say were our superiorities. I'll show you one map. You can go out on the web. Okay, and anti-access area denial bubbles, integrated air defense, air going out to 200 miles, and the Russians are learning to fight and operate within these bubbles that negate a lot of our traditional, what we would say, dominance, to the point now where we have to struggle. You have it in the Baltics. You have a bubble now in eastern Syria. Western Syria, and you have a bubble where in Crimea. So this is all part of preparing for us. Evolution of the Russian military is uneven, but they're much better than where they were. I'm sorry, that was a long answer.
Mike, anything to add?
It's a great answer. I'm trying to think how best to add to that. Dave, obviously a very broad, open-ended question, a lot of places we go with. I would say to add to what Peter said, look, the reforms really got in two phases. There was the late 08 to 2012 reform, which is the bulk of the reforms. And after that, when they changed leadership, they looked at some of the things they did that were right, some things that they were wrong, some places where they reversed. But if I was to paint you broad trends, that the Russian military that's evolving today is one, a Russian military that is very much oriented around not competing but countering with the capabilities that the United States brings to bear. It's essentially a military designed to deny the United States its preferred way of war and a lot of its technological advantages, be able to impose high costs in a fight in Russia's near abroad. Two, it's by and large a military designed for fights across the streets, as in Russia's borders. And in that regard, what Peter said, part of the Russian military is actually quite good. And the rest, a large chunk of it, is actually good enough. And by good enough, I mean with the conflict in Ukraine, and actually the fight in Syria also shows that Russian good enough is perfectly sufficient to defeat most countries on Russia's borders and to present a substantial challenge to others. When we look beyond that, we can look at other capabilities that the Russian armed forces are developing, of course. One of the things that Zapad will show us is much better improved capacity is always moving along Russia to the point of conflict, their ability to command and control different service branches, combined forces. But then also as we look to it, Russia's looking more and more to invest in conventional capabilities that give it limited parity with things that the United States brings to bear and has brought to bear for a long time. Long-range conventional strike, developing a kill chain for precision-guided weapons. In some ways, they're still a ways off from replicating our capability, but on the other hand, they're learning very, very fast, and they have different strategy and doctrine behind it. So I hope that adds somewhat to the question, but the military reform process never ended. It continues perpetually, and Russian force structure and their view of what they need the armed forces to do continues to evolve. The biggest intervening factor in Russian planning was the war in Ukraine. Until the war in Ukraine in 2014, the Russian military was not organizing itself against a large, sizable conflict that would require land forces on its western border. In fact, it wasn't even procuring like a Eurasian land power. It was investing a lot of money in air power, in nuclear forces, and Navy. And then the conflict in Ukraine quickly changed a lot of thinking, and you're going to see this in the state armament program, which is another interesting thing that we're not really here to discuss, but it's going to get signed this year in the coming months, the state armament program for 2018 to 2025. You're going to see a very large change in priorities to land forces and airborne.
One here and then one here. Yeah, sorry, the gentleman here first, and then there, and then back to the back.
Okay, thank you. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. Can you discuss what are your expectations for drilling offensive cyber capabilities during the exercises, both against physical targets and against softer political targets? Is that something that you saw in 2013, and is it something you expect in 2017? Thanks.
All right. As far as offensive cyber in 2013, we may have read some open source about it, but I can't. They're thinking about it. They're testing their command and control. They're protecting, if you will. They're hardening their headquarters. I can't speak to each of the cyber, but I will say as a direct cousin, increasingly enabled by it, they're working hard on electronic warfare and the whole range of capabilities, and I'm sure that they will exercise that in some way during Zapad 2017. Michael?
Yeah. Electronic warfare is a big part of this exercise. We know it will be employed probably early on, and we know electronic warfare troops drilled already in Belarus in preparation for it. On cyber, offensive cyber is one of these things where, one, people don't drill it because if they drill it and you see them drilling it, then you know what they're going to do, then they lose that capacity. So that's not typically, if anybody does it well, that's not typically something that they do that you can see, right? Does Russia have a pretty robust offensive cyber capability? Yes, it does. And there's no way to practically describe it or measure it. Suffice to say, that's kind of the nature of that cyber realm, right? But it's assumed that in that domain, they are probably a near peer to the United States. Are they going to do that to people? No, I doubt they're going to do anything like that as part of this exercise. But they seem to have been pretty effective in using it, out of cycle over the past year.
Beyond,
And could you identify
sure.
yourself? Sorry.
I'm Mike McGough from the LA Times. Beyond cyber, how much of what is being done in this exercise, which you describe as pegged to a defensive scenario, is sort of dual purpose in the sense of helping in an offensive scenario? And is the U.S. worried about that aspect of it? Does it regard any of this as provocative?
Sure. The defensive in and of itself is the scenario is principally defensive. However, defensive or offensive to me are kind of broad characterizations. I mean, look, here's the reality. So if I can deploy a substantial amount of ground forces to Brest and to the border with Poland, then I can say this is very, very defensive deployment. Just trust me, we're stopping right here at the border. You, of course, don't know your measuring capability because you're well aware that intent can change. In fact, intent can change very quickly. It could have been a very defensive exercise, and then once you're there a week later, you're not sure what the country actually intends to do. So that being said, principally, it is very much affected by the bounded rationality of Russian threat perceptions. And Russians are very worried of a Ukraine-type scenario repeating itself in Belarus. And fundamentally, they believe that Ukraine was, a protest movement that was instilled, funded, and supported from the West. And they're concerned of this crisis scenario evolving in Belarus. And of course, much part of the exercise is along that lines in that vein. There is a part of this exercise that, of course, is not defensive, because if your strategy is to show your adversary that you actually have the means to reach out, touch them, punish them, and to compel them with conventional means, those are principally offensive capabilities, right, at the end of the day. And a lot of Russian strategic exercise, when we get to it, they do feature these offensive capabilities because they are part of the Russian strategy of how you would deter what is principally a conventionally superior country from wanting to take you on. As you basically show, listen, I can impose costs to you higher than your stakes in this conflict. Whatever you might want to get out of Belarus, and I can't imagine what you would want out of it, but I assure you that the punishment and the cost and the risk of escalation with Russia will be much worse than that. And those capabilities are principally offensive. They have to be, all right? These are deep strike capabilities, and they have been on display. There's a long-running exercise where Russia's been trying to demonstrate them to the United States to a very attentive audience. It's called Syria, where they're employing all sorts of capabilities that they absolutely do not need in Syria, specifically for the purpose of not just testing them in combat, but to demonstrate them to a Western audience, to show them that they work, to basically give you the truthiness of it, that this works, and that they have the will to use them.
Let me come at your question from a different approach, because it could be either defense but also offense. And they're putting a lot of effort into, again, and we touched on it earlier, on their infrastructure and logistics. The fact that they are mobilizing several thousand railway troops. They can move large, powerful ground formations quickly now on their interior lines. In the West, that means bringing forces in from the Central Military District, Ekaterinburg, and Southern Military District, Rostov, and down there. So they are able to shunt and move back, and that is dangerously offensive as potentially defensive. They're also exercising gas pipeline troops that can run pipe into, for example, Belarus, into improvised airfields, which open source said they're going to be working. They're stressing their medical people, and they're saying that they are preparing their medical side for potentially high casualty action. If that is the case, that is conflict with a peer or near peer foe. And so I think we have to also, and then also societally, their banking and their economic structure, and as Michael said, the civil defense aspect. It's an aggregate. And when you take that to the tooth elements and capabilities, yes, they have a far more flexible offensive capability than they had even 4 years ago. I'm not saying that they want to do it that way, but it's there, and they now can operate very aggressively within their periphery, within what they would call their privileged sphere of influence, which we absolutely disagree with. Former Soviet Union and those regions close.
Yeah, we disagree with it, but you know, 1st Tank Guards Army, along with other ones, make a very strong argument, right? And that's what they're going to show, is the fact that they can be the firstest but the mostest, basically, to anywhere on their borders. And that's the biggest challenge that Russia always works to solve. Why they build this railroad getting around Ukraine, why they constantly working on improving logistics, because you can have a great military, but if you can't get around Russia, which is 1/8 the Earth's landmass, it's not much good. And one of the things this exercise will show is actually how fast and how effectively they can get a substantial, a capable amount of their firepower there to theater.
Gentleman here.
Nick Schifrin with PBS NewsHour. I was hoping that we could switch the discussion about the messaging of the exercise from external to internal. Peter, you mentioned that in 2013, part of the message was to reassure the people of Russia. I'm wondering today, what is the message that this exercise is designed to send to the people of Russia? Is it as simple as 6 months or so before an election, President Putin wants to remind the population that he is the president that modernized the military and projects power? Is there a more complex message than that to his own or to the population in general?
No, Nick, it's a great question, Nick. Let me come at it. First of all, though we clearly defensive, clearly assurance, clearly deterrence, they will first all say that, NATO, the United States in the lead, are conducting their own exercises along our periphery. and we are going to get at your point, we're going to reassure our Russian population that that we see it, we're focusing on it, we're deterring it, we're strong, because in part Russia, with this sort of contrived narrative, is in part the legitimacy of the regime, I believe, is built on threats. And the threats of the West is a big piece, and as much as deterring, it is assuring the Russian population, and then as a subset of the media aspect, and I've seen the media in there, it is 24/7 all about the exercise, and rockets firing, and our patriotic troops out there, and so it's all painting, if you will, this picture that we are the bastion, the Russian military, as throughout its history, are there. We're going to protect the population. We're going to deter threats, and this is what we're doing. And then they'll play on the West and NATO, see what they're doing. These are threats, and we're going to deter that.
Yeah. I think one of the few successes of Vladimir Putin of the last couple of years that consistently gets shown in polling is the restoration of Russian pride in their armed forces, and how people see serving in the Russian military, in part because of a very strong, robust effort by the Ministry of Defense to kind of propagandize and highlight the success of a service, the new technology, all the things they do, in part to a constant media showing footage of successes in the conflict in Syria. But it's one of the few genuine domestic political accomplishments, and in some ways, if you accept the notion that the government has placed a substantial chunk of its legitimacy now on Russia's position in the international system and how it's viewed based on its external successes, the foreign policy successes, rather than the situation in domestic politics, and you see that the armed forces are principally the most important part of that, right? So one thing these exercises once again highlight to Russia is, of course, the message of they have a very capable military, they are indeed a great power, but there's a lot of pride in service. And in terms of threat perception, as I described earlier, there is a genuine kind of force feedback loop with the West, where it's actually Western media that will highlight the threat inflationism and what Russia can actually do, right? Where if the Russians say our forces are this good and this is how many troops we deployed into theater, Russians can safely read Western media to find out that they actually deployed far more forces and they're a much bigger threat and they're far more capable, and there's all this potential, the fear that they inspire and instill in the West. So. And they're going to leverage that. They're going to leverage that reaction, essentially. But on the whole, I think that the Russian military today is very important to the legitimacy of the leadership. It's one of their few bright lights in what is principally a country that has a lot of internal problems, and I'm sure many Russia watchers are well aware of.
Would either of you connect it all to the presidential election coming up in Russia?
I think it's a factor, but they would do it anyway. I think you saw it in 2013.
Obviously, it's a regular exercise.
Yeah.
Scheduled every 4 years for September, you know. Incidentally, there's a presidential, it's not an election, it's a presidential selection. It's just one letter different, but it's slightly.
Well said.
Yeah, no, they don't need this exercise for the election that they're not really going to have. Okay? You can be blunt about that. Right?
Absolutely. Anyone? Other questions? Sorry, over here.
Couchman with Defense Priorities. Kurt Couchman with Defense Priorities. When the 2013 exercises happened, what was the U.S. domestic response, both in terms of the executive branch and the legislative branch? And based on the changing relationship between the two countries since then, what would you expect this time around?
Well, I think that again, if we look at the time, the reset is really in deep duress. We haven't seen we've seen the Russians working hard to improve their military, but they haven't launched in any adventures since Georgia at that point. So we I think see it first and foremost as a military exercise. They hadn't violated UN convention and invaded Ukraine yet. So it was kind of, let's watch it. They're developing and working, but I don't think anybody expected them to launch a major adventure at that time. Everybody was watching it, and of course, you know, there's a lot of still bellicose Russian narrative about the Baltics being in NATO and all of that. But no, I don't think we thought that they were going to cross the line at that time. I don't think so. I think the capability is there, but if you're a Russian, all right, I'm going to launch my military into the Baltics for whatever reason. Maybe there's something bad happens in Belarus. All right, you've done it. You can do it in the first 72 hours. You get what your immediate ground, and then what? What's next? They're sitting on something. The world is screaming at them. They probably they've tripped Article 5, and they don't know the uncertainty of Article 5. And this is getting at the regime. I would submit that Russia is a pseudo-democratic, autocratic kleptocracy. Money matters to this regime, the moneyed interests. And to launch into an adventure that doesn't seem to be existential. Now, if they thought Belarus was going to wobble to the west, or Ukraine was going to enter NATO, or something like that, that would create, I believe, an existential push in their mind. But I think that they're going to, as the gentleman before, they're going to huff and puff. They're going to test their capability. They're going to do some sea landing in the Baltics to get everybody nervous, and they're going to assure their population and test their capabilities.
Yeah, I have to say. So I think that we kind of, between Zapad 2013 and Zapad 2017, we kind of have the typical flailing problem of Russians are 4 feet tall and 12 feet tall. So Zapad 2013, now still in government time, a lot of people did not take Russian military reforms or modernization seriously. They were busy looking at other target sets, other problems in the U.S. government. And people really thought that, the reforms are dead, they always fail, nothing's going to come of it. And I was reading this like often wrong but never in doubt dismissiveness that comes out of U.S. policy establishment. And so Zapad 2013, I think the view was like, there's nothing going to be any major here, okay? And then back then, the view of Russians was definitely towards the 4 foot tall mark. Now comes Zapad 2017, after annexation Crimea, fight in eastern Ukraine, Syria. Now Russians are like 12 feet tall, right? Would they invade Baltics with no strategic operational objective, pick a fight with the world's largest conventional military and nuclear alliance over something with no discernible, strategic relevance? Yeah, I don't think so. So, long story short on that is we're going to see a much more evolved, more capable Russian military, but there's a reason why having basically had conventional overmatch in the region for, 15 years easily straight, Russians don't wake up every morning and decide to invade the Baltics. They know, they can count, they're really good at math, they can see.
It would have to be a hard sell even to the Russian population. They might buy the narrative in the beginning. And also, I think, again, these interests, a failed adventure like that at that scale could bring the whole regime down.
Yeah, I think...
Yeah.
I think the big thing to understand that the Russian military is much more effective and very capable as an instrument of coercion. The bigger concern and threat is always that over some years, Russians evolved much better and more robust capability in unconventional warfare, in irregular warfare, and political warfare. And you have to understand that a very capable conventional military makes a very strong, compelling argument, and you can achieve a lot of effects with it on the cheap. That's how Crimea was basically annexed without a shot, all right? If you do certain things and you deploy 40,000 troops to somebody's border and you say, look, if you resist, I don't know what's going to happen, but it might end up a lot worse for you than not resisting. Now you have a real useful instrument of national power, and now you have a real coercive tool. But principally, it is just not set up as an instrument to invade and occupy for the short reason is that it does not have an operational reserve. It really lacks the manpower, right? One thing that the Russian military, the ground force, does not have, it's just not set up as a military to sustain long fights away from its borders. It's not built that way. Now, maybe at some point they will build it that way. I don't know. But that's not the way the military reforms and the modernization process went. So it's not a tool that's meant for that particular job.
George.
Thanks. We've talked about a couple of different audiences for this exercise, one being the West, the U.S. and NATO, another being Russia's domestic audience. I wonder if you could comment on a potential third category, which would be viewers, audiences outside of Europe, outside of the United States. Is Russia thinking about their reactions to this? What might their intentions be in terms of signaling those audiences?
That's an interesting question.
And sorry, this is George Beebe, the director of the center's new intelligence program.
It's an interesting question. I think that in the last 2 years, particularly in the Middle East, Russia's followed a bit of a policy of success begets success, and what had happened was they had first demonstrated limited capability for expeditionary operations. Then they found that actually limited application of military power in the way they did it together with Iran and other forces in Syria could really shape the battlefield, achieve political ends. In fact, the big story that's happening this week, truthfully, is not Zapad. It is their basic seizure of Deir el-Zor and pushing the Saudis to accept their position on the Astana talks, which are two not at all insignificant successes, right? The real Russian military successes taking place are all in Syria today and across the Middle East. And so in that regard, I thought the Russian approach was to establish a power broker role on the cheap, although their actual ability to broker things and influence local actors in Syria has consistently been demonstrated to be much poorer than they themselves advance normally in conversation. That said, having tried this on in the Middle East and found some success, the Russian view has always been, well, this suit kind of fits me. Actually, let's see where else I can be a power broker on the cheap. Maybe I can come to Libya and broker some things here. Maybe I should look for a potential role in Afghanistan. Maybe I can play a much broader role. So the short answer is that I think looking beyond its region, Russia sees there's distinct opportunity, both because of the nature of events, because it's found a lot more confidence in its ability to project military power, perhaps in a limited capacity, but still in a meaningful one. And because other countries have sort of accepted and changed their view on Russia to say, look, in the current international system, there's actually very few countries that can project power without the United States support, and more importantly, despite it. It's you only need one hand to count it, basically, right? And if they can shape events outside the region, then they are a player to worth consider. So I think from Russian perspective, it's always they're trying to demonstrate themselves as a power in the international system, and they're trying to signal to other audiences where they may be what their potential is. I hope that kind of makes sense. But the Middle East, the top region I see where Russia's kind of trying on this power broker role. And the truth is that I think there's a lot less there than meets the eye. But they've demonstrated a lot of success for very, very low cost in terms of what they invested politically, economically, militarily.
Yeah, again, great question. If we look at Russia, they had a run of success in 2014 until I would submit the shoot down of Air Malaysia by the separatists. And then until Syria, it was nothing but bad news. And then getting at what Michael is talking about, since Syria, they've been able to regain their balance internationally. Because up until that time, they were in the global doghouse. And other than sanctions, they have broken out, if you will, politically and in their foreign policy. It's uneven, it doesn't really work, and they may ultimately get totally bogged down in Syria, but they now are seen as serious players and serious interlocutors in much of the global fora. Remember, they had been thrown out by the G8. You know, so they've gotten that balance back. I think they've got more confidence back. Putin seems to be more confident. The fact that he's all over the world right now in working these issues, whether it's Korea or Syria, he doesn't seem particularly obsessed right now about what's going on in Europe, though they work hard in it, which tells me is another indicator they're not looking to launch an adventure in Zapad 17.
Yeah, I would say when we were there in April and other times this year, the Russian investors have been very distinct. One is they're pretty confident. They felt that they've had a bit of a winning streak the last couple of years, and that their view of their approach to the United States and bilateral relationship is, look, take it or leave it. We would like to improve relations. We would like to work together in areas of mutual interest, but we don't need you. Okay? We don't necessarily need to restore the relationship with you. There's much more confidence there than you would expect, given what you may consider to be Russia's various economic woes and domestic political problems. They don't feel it that way, and that's very important because obviously, you know, reality is a matter of perception, and over in Moscow, the perception is quite different. And one thing this exercise shows, by the way, consistently, the Western expertise that says, oh, this conflict in Ukraine and this conflict in Syria, they're very expensive, they're hard to sustain. Well, actually, what's probably more expensive is this strategic operational exercise that they do every year. That takes a lot of money. I mean, a colossal amount of money. And they do it every year without a problem. So they clearly feel that they have the resources for all of it, to cover all of it.
Down here.
Sean Verma at the Washington Post. I was just wondering, for Poland and Latvia and Lithuania, the countries in the shadow of Zapad, are there any
particular sort of demonstrations of Russian military capabilities that would cause genuine surprise or alarm in the next few weeks?
I think all of them cause alarm in the Baltics. I'm not sure what military capabilities Russia can demonstrate that don't cause alarm in the Baltics, to be frank. But that's the reality of being a small country with a small population, a small military, living next to a very large country that has a very clear recent history of invading its neighbors, right? And it's just that said, as always, the capabilities that people look out for distinct signs of is one, Russia's ability to shift large, heavy ground formations to the Baltic theater, which is not nearly as easy as it may sound. Yes, all of Russian troops move by railroad. That being said, it's an important demonstration of how fast you can get there with a lot of firepower. Second, of course, what Russian airspace forces can do, where they shift aviation, what their capacity is to conduct long-range conventional strikes. And third is probably if there's a nuclear component to this exercise or some exercise that follows this exercise, that's a very important one for NATO countries. Peter,
I think it's also very important that I think the rhetoric concerning Zapad that we saw in the early midsummer into the late summer, which was quite strident, has calmed down a little bit. Right from the NATO Secretary General, even the Balts are now a little bit more circumspect how they view. They see a very, very serious threat potentially, but more and more there's a growing body that doesn't believe the Russians are going to invade, though they worry about the gray zone activities. And that's something we haven't really talked much about, is that while they've really, really revamped their conventional side, they have this other, if you will, piece, the gray zone, ambiguous world that kind of blends in and out of conventional operations. That also worries, if you will, the Baltic region. Another thing is remember that NATO, and I know it looks symbolic, they're not huge formations. In fact, you have now NATO battalions with some American units as well in the Baltic states, in Poland. We may say it's small, the critics, but it got the Russians' attention. Because the Russians now know, yes, they might have massive conventional overmatch, but now they have a lot more to reckon with, including potentially killing NATO Europeans and American NATO allies.
Okay, back here, yes, sir.
Hi, I'm David Smith of The Guardian. I'm just wondering, do you think President Trump has had any discernible impact on these military exercises or in other ways, or if we were talking about a President Rubio or President Bush or President Clinton, would basically all of this be happening in exactly the same way?
I think that we appropriately have been increasingly measured about it. Let the Russians have their exercise, set limits. There will be the narrative. We will continue to reassure our own side. We will take defensive steps, which NATO has done. And most importantly is while being firm, be careful with language, be careful with actions, though be sure the Russians know that we have lots of capabilities to intervene. So I think people are being pretty calm and measured right now, and that's the right approach. Because perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, the worst thing that could happen is we take a really aggressive, robust action, and we have a aviation or naval accident or incident, and now we have a crisis, and we don't have the links to deconflict them like we used to. And now we're in potential cyber-fast trouble. From my perspective, the Trump administration on this has acted quite responsibly and really in sync with prior administrations on something like this.
Yeah, I think that whatever you may think of the Trump administration, actually all the main efforts to conduct exercises in Europe with NATO, increasing the spending on European Reassurance Initiative, which are now trying to rebrand into European Deterrence Initiative, adding money to that, that's all continuing afoot. And in fact, under the Trump administration, both exercises, spending on U.S. force posture, presence, and all that in Europe and among NATO allies has only been increasing, is the reality of it. So the United States has been kind of doubling down slowly and surely on both reassuring allies and on developing, at least, or getting on the path of improving with confidence that we can deter Russia in some of these worst-case scenarios. Beyond that, I mean, so my view from Peter on sort of the reaction to this exercise is a bit more mixed, because it's just fascinating that even within countries with small policy establishments, like I look at Estonia, and you'll have really sharp Russia experts like Christian Prick saying, really, like, there's no problem, we're not concerned there's going to be an invasion of Estonia as part of this exercise, it's fine. But then you have a completely different message from the Minister of Defense or the President, and so sometimes you get a case of really smart people saying stupid things as a result of this. I think the U.S. response has been more measured, but still, we've had a number of weird statements from senior leaders, like maybe Russia will leave its troops in Belarus for some unknown purpose or things along that line. By and large, the response, I think, is measured, and there's good cause for prudent vigilance. But one of the big challenges, of course, is always what happens after the exercise. From my perspective, in all such events, the exercise itself is never the problem. The sort of period of danger is what it takes place after the exercise. That's the time to be vigilant, not during or before.
Terrific. Okay, one here.
Thanks, Pat Tucker from Defense One again. Going back to this leaving a lot of troops in Belarus for some unknown purpose, which you sort of dismissed. It's something that defense officials in Estonia and Lithuania, and I'm told even off the record in Belarus, have brought up. Why is that not a major concern? And were that to happen, what would the appropriate response be, and what would the expected response be?
Well, why would they do it? Like, let's think about, A, why would they do that? 2, Russian troops, one, not only are based in Belarus, there are 2 Russian facilities with troops in Belarus, but Russian troops have been drilling in Belarus all summer and spring, and they haven't been left there. They just keep, coming and going. And lastly, these are things that people say, but they can't explain why anybody would do that, like just leave troops in tents shivering in Belarus over the fall and winter. Like you don't just deploy your troops end of September in Belarus, and then you leave them there, and what are they going to do? Are they going to sit somewhere outside of Brest? Like, what's the plan, the strategy? How many troops are they going to leave in Belarus? So let's look at total forces being shifted into Belarus. We can go max. I mean, their number is 3,000. Let's say max is something between 10 and 15,000. Who's going to support them? Are 15,000 troops in your worst-case nightmare scenario enough to take over Belarus? Let's look at the map, and let's look at 15,000 troops.
I think also very important is the nature of the Belarusian regime. And Alexander Lukashenko, while clearly a Russian ally, he's a prickly ally, and was verbal about how he negatively viewed what happened in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. The Russians already have the relations in there, and if they really wanted to be in Belarus with a lot of forces, they could be in Minsk in a few hours with a lot of people. Why, unless Lukashenko does a side deal, yeah, you can station them in there, but he's if you read about him, he's prickly about Belarusian, his perspective of independence, and while they may tilt to Russia, anybody in Belarus under 35, 40 years old don't remember the USSR or the Russians as being part of that. So they have to, I think the Russians have to be, I think they realize it, they'll work, they already are in there. They're doing little exercises, they have logistics elements in there full time. I think they net no gain either strategically, because the forces are just a few hours away, and more importantly, politically in Europe, where they're trying to lower the temperature so they get the bloody sanctions off of them.
Yeah.
Let me maybe follow up briefly on that question. Setting aside the question of why Russia would want to take over Belarus.
No one ever explains this.
If one were in the Russian leadership and wanted to do that, is the Russian military actually the right instrument to do that?
Well, no, I mean...
Do they have other instruments beside the Russian military?
My personal view that they have the Belarusian military. I mean, I'll be honest, have you ever seen the Russian Chief of General Staff present with the Minister of Defense of Belarus right after him? It's the same person talking. He does the other half of the brief. I just saw it in April, right? I'm just being frank with you, right? That there's a Russia has a really good military in the event it needs to do anything in Belarus. It's called the Belarus military. It's not very hard to buy that and that intelligence service, all right? It's a similar problem always has been the case in Ukraine, right, where a lot of people worried that half of Ukraine's SBU was on the FSB's payroll, and that's probably true. So long story short on that is there's no reason for Russian troops to come invade Belarus. The Belarusian military is tiny. And I assure you, from what I've seen, I suspect that in the event that Russia wanted to do something, it would not be very hard to leverage that force and those security forces to their advantage.
All right. Nobody else, then I guess last one here.
Yes, I'm going to ask you kind of a two-part question here. You mentioned the long-range forces, and so they're obviously part of ZAPAD with the long-range aviation, and you mentioned the Northern Fleet kind of having a separate exercise there. How many of these exercises might be like out of area? Like you might conduct like a long-range bomber drill, or have the fleets already out, especially the submarines out to the Atlantic, and practice whatever it is that they might do, like with the cruise missiles and whatnot. You kind of touched on it, Peter, with the gray zone stuff. Is there a component of this where you might see some of those special operations forces to conduct those kinds of operations? I mean, like, there's been a lot of talk about this Gerasimov doctrine, but there doesn't appear to be an actual Gerasimov doctrine per se. I mean, how would that be a part of any of this?
Yeah, Peter, tell us about the Gerasimov doctrine.
It came out of a journal, a relatively obscure journal, the Voyny Premonitions Journal, the Military Industrial. It's a set of ideas and thoughts. Bottom line, what you're seeing here is you're seeing some little aspects of it during ZAPAD. There are airborne companies that are moving around. They were doing some pre-training in Belarus, possibly one up in the far north. The Russians have always worked in the gray zone. In the old days, it used to be called agitprop and all of that. I mean, it's not new. They've just have refined it, and it's more sophisticated, and it's kind of fallen under this rubric of the new generation warfare. It's been coined the Gerasimov doctrine because of the article, and then it came right before Crimea. But what makes it particularly difficult today is that it's cyber-enabled. And what used to be a whispering campaign 100 years ago, which would take weeks, now you can do it in seconds over the web and in various means. So it's definitely part of that. And the whole gray zone that you talk about brings out to me something that we in the West have real trouble with. And there's an organic ruthlessness in the gray zone where the Russians use these operations, whether it is disinformation, fake news, political assassinations, and all kinds of other things that we in a peacetime situation can't get our heads around. We can be plenty ruthless in war, and so they have us continually on our heels because it also is installed on our media. We saw what happened to our body politic in last winter with the elections. So it's all part. They do write about it. You can call it a lot of things. I think the Gerasimov doctrine, though, was the closest thing said to, I think, the little green man and everything else, and that's why it was coined that way. The Russians don't call it that. And what do you, Michael?
Yeah. So I think Peter gave a great answer to your question on employment of irregular formations. I mean, I think you'll see special forces deployed to Belarus, and a lot of this exercise will be an integration of those capabilities on the lower end together with a whole set of all the high-end capabilities. Of course, the fleets will deploy, long-range aviation will deploy. They'll do probably practice missions of various targeting ranges and all that. On the Gerasimov doctrine, it's not a thing. Never has been, never will be. Gerasimov doesn't have a doctrine, didn't write it. There's no such thing. The Gerasimov doctrine, as Peter put it well, look, it was a point of term of art. Here's the reality of what the Gerasimov doctrine is. Gerasimov, in his first couple weeks as Chief of General Staff, has to give an annual lecture to the Military Academy of Sciences. And he gave this long-winded lecture on the nature of modern warfare and kind of the threat from the West. It had this really long, boring name. And then he said, I want to write that up on an article, guys, get some colonels together, put this piece out as a summary, as an article of how I see the threat from the West and the nature of modern conflict. And that was his article in VPK. And then I have a very good colleague who in his blog kind of summarized his views on it and coined the Gerasimov doctrine, which he has since recanted and said, yeah, that was meant to be sort of a good way to put it on on this blog, which is pretty influential. I didn't mean literally that there's a Gerasimov doctrine, okay, or that Gerasimov is like the leading light of Russian military thought, or that what Gerasimov said was a doctrine, because as you know, in the Russian armed forces, they communicate to each other in public journals, and they display their doctrine publicly in slides that they then publish, right? Because that's how the Russian general staff works. I'm being sarcastic, of course, completely ridiculous. So the long story short is, no, it's not a thing. Nobody in Russian military analytical circles takes it seriously. It's short reference for the publication of that article, but occasionally it's sort of a zombie theory that just comes back and comes back. It's very hard to kill it.
Peter, you had a brief comment.
Yeah, I know we're closing. Just a couple points. What this brings out is that there is still an enormous stress and tension in the West in regard to us, NATO, and Russian Federation. And I would submit that we need to be thinking about a dual-track policy. I think we've tried to do it. It's very, very difficult. And one is what is happening already. It's firmly setting boundaries. The sanctions are important, very important for that. Supporting your allies, assurance, and pushing back on transgressions. But where we are struggling with, I believe, is in the second part of the dual track are the conduits. And it's difficult because the Russians are difficult. But you need conduits first to be able to talk everybody off the ledge in a crisis, accident or incident. The arms control regimen is just a shadow of what it's for. It's atrophied. That's dangerous when you're dealing with a nuclear-tipped superpower. And then finally, without that, you can't get at problem solving internationally. And those conduits need to be global, not just administration Moscow to Washington. They need to be for military districts, to combatant commands around the world, because the crisis could be somewhere else. And then when the crisis arrives in Washington and in Moscow, it's too late in this cyber world. And we just don't have that. I saw it when I was there from 12 to 14. As ugly as it was, we had conduits, rightfully so. They were cut off at the time with their aggression in Ukraine. But this is something we need to find a way to very, very carefully build back, while always pushing back on the Russians when they transgress.
Yeah.
Mike,
Sure.
last word. One minute.
1 minute. I'll compress it. So I would like to introduce perhaps some better terms of art and explain why they're relevant to this exercise. So Gerasimov, along with other probably much more thoughtful military thinkers in Russian armed forces, were discussing throughout the 2000s the problem that they described as new generation warfare and new type warfare. And this problem set was essentially the phasing of combat operations such that most of the conflicts decided before war is declared, and war is actually never declared, that conflict is unacknowledged in the international system. And it's an integration of asymmetric means like political warfare, regular warfare, along with some high-end capabilities that range from cyber to nuclear end. Now, the Russian answer to this, as they framed it, the real kind of doctrinal approach, is this concept of strategic deterrence, which is both employs a whole host of conventional means, a whole host of non-military means like cyber, which I was asked about earlier here, and things that can have kinetic effects but in and of themselves are not kinetic, and also nuclear weapons. And the Russian view of this is that part of the discussion on new generation warfare was a bit envious. These are things the Russians thought the West was doing to them and that they would like to have the opportunity to do as well, and we've seen some of that in the last couple of years. But suffice to say, what Zapad really reflects is this integrated Russian approach to how they would handle a crisis, how they employ these different means, right, in a crisis scenario and then in conflict to either defend against the United States and a NATO coalition or simply to prevent the crisis from becoming an actual war by coercing the West to terms favorable to Russia. Hope that makes sense.
Thanks very much, and thank you again all for coming.
Great job.